Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the celebration of life for Dr. J. Robert Beyster. I'm Ben Haddad, former SAIC Senior Vice President for Communications and a forever friend of the Beyster family. I'm going to be your MC for today's celebration, or what some are calling one final Management Council meeting. Of course, this is more than just another business meeting. This is about family, about friends, about the tremendous love we all have for Dr. Beyster. We're here at the Hilton, Mission Bay, because it was the site for some of the very early meetings, weeks, and management councils, also for holiday parties for the company, and for Beyster family parties. And of course, it's no accident that we're here on a Saturday. After all, I know what you're thinking out there. Any of you longtime SAIC folks remember a Saturday when you weren't working? Well, we're going to hear a lot of good descriptors about Bob today: scientist, entrepreneur, patriot, all that. But let's not forget relentless. We have quite a celebration in store for you this afternoon, as you can see in the program. We're going to hear from 6 very special speakers. We're going to view a wonderful video for Dr. B, and we're going to be entertained by world-renowned pianist Gustavo Casanave. In fact, Gustavo has already been tinkling the ivories over there, working his magic. He was at the piano when you were entering the room and watching the photo montage. Gustavo is a classical, contemporary, and jazz pianist, a composer and a producer, also a Grammy nominee. And since performing at the Heart of San Diego Gala back in 2008, which honored Bob and Betty, he and his wife, Vicki, have been very good friends with the Beyster family. And both of them have traveled from their home in New York City today to be with us. We're going to hear more from Gustavo a little later in the program. Before we go any further, though, let's formally open our program with a Pledge of Allegiance. Keep your seats for just a second. Our color guard today is not from the armed services. Rather, we're going to be hearing or seeing the Boy Scout Troop 271. Now, why the Boy Scouts, you ask? Well, Dr. Beyster was a Boy Scout, achieving the rank of Star Scout. Some of you may recall a passage in Bob's book, The SAI Solution, where he says, "Only twice in my adolescence did I go to summer camp. We learned to swim and canoe, and I found out there that I was not good at many sports. To compensate, I always tried harder." Now, there's an apt description of Bob's life philosophy. Troop 271 contains members and scoutmasters who are friends of the Beyster family. Please welcome to the stage Michael Ciernan, Senior Patrol Leader and leader of the troop's color guard for the flag ceremony. Michael?
May the audience please rise for the presentation of the colors. Color guard attention. Color guard forward march. Color guard, prepare to post the colors. Color guard, post the colors. Face the flag. All those non-uniform, please place your right hand over your heart. All those in uniform, salute. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ready, 2, face the front. Color guard, regroup. Color guard, dismissed. The audience may be seated.
Thank you, Michael. Let's have a great hand for Boy Scout Troop 271. Well, you may have noticed a pair of large vehicles just outside the hotel. It's always good to have a fire truck around, just in case, but that's not why it's here. During the devastating Witch Creek fire in 2007, that San Pasqual volunteer firefighters had one of their fire engines severely damaged. As many of you recall, there were 5 significant wildfires burning simultaneously that year, and Dr. Beyster contacted the San Diego Foundation to inquire how he could help. When told of the truck, he immediately donated over $200,000 to complete the funding for a new fire engine. Bob then went on to financially support the county's 27 volunteer fire departments every year thereafter. For all he did to enhance public safety, Bob is being honored today by the San Diego Regional Fire Foundation by having you see that truck that he rode in during a grant awards ceremony. Let's give the hand to the firefighters around San Diego and everywhere. And then there's that other large vehicle, fondly known by SAIC and Leidos employees as a VACUS. For the great unwashed, this stands for Vehicle and Cargo Inspection System. If you got anywhere near it as you walked in, you're now radioactive. Well, actually not really. I'm told the X-ray dosage you received is really not likely fatal. You're good. Seriously, the VACUS is one of SAIC's and now Leidos' great success stories, helping to protect the United States and its allies abroad around the world. It is deployed at seaports, international borders, anywhere and everywhere cargo is being shipped. You've probably seen them on the news, but had no idea that this is an SAIC and Leidos product. It's here today as a symbol of Dr. Beyster's incredible genius and ingenuity and his passion for solving our nation's most pressing and complex problems. And needless to say, I am honored and humbled to be part of this celebration. Dr. Beyster was a rare individual, much like that guy George Bailey in the movie It's a Wonderful Life, though on a much larger scale. Dr. B changed thousands of lives directly, and no telling how many millions indirectly, through the many programs of SAIC that were and are a part of our national security. And his family is pretty special too. His wife Betty, children Jim, Mark, and M.A., and Mark's wife Lan, Bob's grandchildren Cody and Brad, and their wives Joni and Kimmy, and Bob's great-grandchild Garrett, right down here in the front row with us. Let's give them all a very big hand too. Since Bob's passing, the family has received literally thousands of thoughtful, caring messages. Certainly many of you in this room, and from countless others who could not be with us today. The messages have come electronically, on the blog site, in emails, on condolence cards, and even long handwritten letters. And obviously we don't have time to read all of these heartfelt notes, or the time to mention all of your names. But rest assured, the family knows who you are, and they appreciate every word. Also, just prior to this celebration, the family received 2 special accommodations. Betty received the Secretary of Defense Medal for Bob's 31 years of outstanding public service as a member of STRATCOM's Strategic Advisory Group. And Congresswoman Susan Davis presented the family with her special tribute to Bob that was entered into the congressional record earlier this week. Before introducing our first speaker, I just want to paraphrase one of the bloggers that I mentioned. He's actually here today, but I'm not going to mention his name. That'd be unfair to the rest of you who blogged away. But I know he's going to recognize his words. I thought this note captured what Dr. Beyster meant to so many of us. He wrote the following: within the span of several generations, very few personalities will emerge that are universally recognized as great men or women. These people, these very few, accomplished extraordinary things for the benefit of their people and their societies. Bob Beyster was certainly one of those. We should all feel immensely privileged to have walked in his shadow and benefited from his truly great gifts, not the least of which he was a really good person. We are all now less with his absence in body, but his spirit lives on in the many lives he has touched. May he enjoy an eternity of fair winds and a following sea. Ladies and gentlemen, our first speaker this afternoon came all the way from Maryland, like a lot of you. He spent over 43 years with SAIC and also worked with MA the past 8 years on DARPA Small Business Innovation. He's a strong advocate of employee ownership. Please welcome Jim Russell. Sure.
Well, it's a real honor to be here at a celebration for Bob Beyster. He gave me opportunity, inspiration, and friendship with him and his family. I'd like my remarks to be in behalf of many of you in the room because you have similar stories. It was in 1972, I was leaving RAC, and I was going to start my own company, and I went out to interview Bob Beyster. I talked to two people. I came out of the office. They're leaning up against the wall. The first time I saw him was Bob Beyster with his blue sport coat and either white or blue socks. I'm not sure which it was. He said, "Let's go to lunch." We went to lunch. I think halfway through I knew what I wanted to do, which was join SAIC because of the principles that he offered. Best decision I ever made. So I came over, brought 11 people over, and a couple months later, 9 more. It was a little more gutsy as I reflected back on it than I realized at the time you have to have such thing as a charge number. But But we made it. I won some contracts on defense and a bunch on the NIH side in the health area. And those were great times. Shortly thereafter, he asked me to go to corporate and help build a company. And I was pleased to do that. And my story is like one of thousands. What he cared for, I found out, was family. He cared for the nation. He cared for SAIC and the employees, and he wanted to create a place where you could do important work and get fairly rewarded. And those are the things that really struck me. Shortly after going over there, he asked me to start the Corporate Proposal Center, which we didn't have. Our win rate was a little bit down. We might have had 1,000 contracts, and he thought by starting a corporate proposal center, we could get the win rate up. So he said, "But I'm not going to give you any money for the corporate proposal center. You got to go get it from the line managers." I had a way. So we stood it up, we got it going, and it made a difference. A short time after that, he called me 9 o'clock my time in McLean, 6 o'clock local time, and said, "I drove by the proposal center the other night at 9 o'clock and the lights weren't on. What's going on?" His way of boosting you along. But it made a difference. We got the win rate up about 70%. And I wrote a paper on it. I said, "Are proposal center people crazy or just different?" So shortly after that, because I tracked the defense automation contract for 10 years, I called him and said, "I'd like to bid this $1 billion contract." He said, "What? We can't do that. That's something we've done before." And I said, "Well, I've been tracking it, and I think we got a chance." He said, "Well, come out and brief the Business Acquisition Council, and we'll see how it goes." So I did. I came out. They didn't like it. He was silent. And so I got beat up pretty good. I was a little bit upset. We got done, and he said, "Relax, I'm going to let you do it." He gave me a lot of backing. And we won with a fly-off with a lot of help from a lot of people. It did change the complexion of the company, but it demonstrated he'd take a calculated gamble, and I appreciated that. One other story I'd like to tell is the longest laugh I ever saw Bob Beyster have. We were out on the Chesapeake, sailing, which he always liked to do. I was with Matt Tubriner and Ron Arnold, Ron's birthday, and he asked me what I thought about his briefing at Management Council at a place like this. I said, "Oh, you did great." But it was standing room only, and I was standing up on the side. And you have to remember one thing. I learned how to sleep standing up. I swear he started to laugh. He laughed for 10 minutes. And we laughed at him laughing. I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that memory. His legacy is carried forward by over 200,000 people that worked with the company, by the Foundation for Employee Ownership, so aptly run by Mary Ann. I've been pleased to help that a little bit. By the Beyster Institute, by the fellows and the fellowships, and by his books. How I will remember Bob Beyster in conclusion is first of all through his wonderful family. His genius, his friendship, the many laughs we had, and his enormous impact on all of us. There'll never be anybody like Bob Beyster. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Our next speaker also came from the Washington, D.C. area, and he was an early hire at SAI, preceding the addition of a C at the end of the company name, and one of Bob's fellow nuclear physicists. His son, Matt, is a practicing attorney here in San Diego, so when he and his wife, Pam, came to visit Matt, the three of them would have regular visits with Bob and Betty. Today, he would like to share his views of Bob as a leader from their work together at the Defense Nuclear Agency. Please welcome Gil Benninger.
Betty, family, many friends. It's been nearly 37 years since I first met Bob. I was a new hire working in the Washington office in support of a DNA contract. Bob was in town. He stopped by, stuck his head in the door, and welcomed me to SAI. I happened to mention SAI, or DNA, excuse me, and it brought an approving smile. Over the next few years, I got to know Bob through participation in DNA program reviews and business meetings. It also gave me an opportunity to meet many of the SAI folks from around the country who were supporting DNA programs. And it was very clear that Bob had recruited some very smart and talented people working on challenging programs. It was also clear that he took a personal interest in the work and would offer corporate assistance as needed, although sometimes with the strings attached. The DNA business was growing, and Bob was the passionate leader. I believe, thinking back, that it may have been Bill Scott who first mentioned to me the importance of DNA to the early days of SAI. DNA funded one of SAI's first contracts, a 70K effort, which certainly was vital at that time to the young company. But the contract was more than just a funding source for SAI. It was an opportunity for Bob to continue working in an area that interests him, which is his expertise, and it also gave him a vehicle on which to recruit like-minded scientists. Scott believed, and that was his argument, that Bob had always had a soft spot in his heart for DNA, and for that reason was sometimes generous with regard to his time and the resources that he would devote to help people grow their business opportunities. I didn't know if Bill's assessment was correct. I had no reason to understand one way or another, or whether it was simply, from Bob's point of view, DNA was just another business opportunity. Regardless, which was right, under his leadership, SAI became a major performer on DNA programs with annual revenues in excess of $50 million. That up from the original 70K. Our work spanned DNA's entire R&D portfolio, and even though and this is what is amazing, and even though the funding was less than 1% of SAI's revenue, Bob stayed closely attuned to the work and the business opportunities. Sometime around 1980, his office called and asked me to schedule a meeting at DNA. I could add additional meetings of my choosing, and a morning time slot was made available for Bob's schedule. That visit went well, and Bob decided to schedule half-day visits on a regular basis, 4 to 5, maybe 6 times a year. For each visit, we would schedule multiple meetings throughout the morning. We could meet with senior agency leaders, line managers, or scientists who were managing DNA's R&D programs. Of course, the mix would vary between each visit and as determined by the availability of the DNA staff and our particular interests. The discussions could cover a broad spectrum of topics: nuclear weapons phenomenology, survivability, vulnerability, weapons effects testing, support to military commands, and so on. It was endless. And regardless of the topic, Bob was prepared and he was well-versed. He enjoyed the discussions and he could engage with all staff members regardless of their position or their title. But these visits, as Bob and I supposedly convinced ourselves of, were more about marketing SAI ideas and talent. So to achieve this objective, we put together, of course, a foolproof plan. I would prepare a crib sheet folded longwise, not the other way. It had to be folded a certain way, but I would prepare the crib sheet that had the agenda, the itinerary, and talking points. I would pick up Bob. He would look at the sheet. He would add his own talking points. He would modify what I put on there. And by the time we got to the DNA parking lot, we were ready to go. We had it down pat. Certainly nothing could go wrong. And we had this time to the minute. Well, and there are several people in this room that know exactly what I'm talking about. Anyone who has ever had an opportunity to spend time trying to manage Bob's schedule knew that the deck was stacked against me. So it should be no surprise that the first of our game plan to unravel was the schedule. And boy, that would start to fall apart as soon as we walked in the lobby of that building. Somebody who I hadn't scheduled a meeting with would see Bob, would come over, and they would talk for 30, 45 seconds, and well, you know, if you got time before you leave the building, I really need to talk to you. So, of course, that person then got put on the list as well. That would sort of mess up our schedule, so then I had to start contracting because we had a "you shall reappear back in McLean no later than." And the people back there who enforced that, I didn't care to get into arguments with. So we had to, on the run, start mentally adjusting these things. And so, after all, we got the schedule straightened out, but we would even, with the last minute additions, of course, it was difficult to keep everything on schedule because of our commitments that Bob would have in the afternoon back in McLean. But the challenge was never really to find a topic to start the conversation with, but rather to gracefully transition to the next meeting in a timely manner. Now, the talking points, which we labored over, were also at risk as the morning progressed. It all fell apart. The DNA folks had their own talking points, and they would start the meeting with a topic, oftentimes, that they knew Bob was especially interested in, or they knew could tweak Bob a little bit. And so they would do that. Now, these discussions could go just about in any direction from that. Mind you, since I was the note taker, without any segues as they transition from one topic to another. I'm sitting there trying to standard-sized notebook, keep track of what's going on, the discussion, and I would be filling up page after page after page, and occasionally Bob would sense that I was falling behind a little bit, so he would help out. And he would reach into his pocket, and he would pull out the Beyster book. So this was like the cavalry arriving. Now, in case you can't, yes, you see, scale, my book, many pages, the Beyster book. But then what he does, he opens the book and he just makes a couple notations, and then he sets it down. So the cavalry arrives, and then the cavalry disappears, and I'm left there trying to figure out what to get into this book and get all the notes. By the time the last meeting ended and we left the building, I would say Bob was both on an adrenaline high as well as a caffeine high, which of course I'm sure did not necessarily bode well for the folks scheduled for the afternoon sessions back in McLean. In any event, that was not my problem. It was now my job to try to make sense of these notes. And that was no small task given the breadth of the topics and the detail that they covered. To say nothing of the fact that I probably missed a third of what was said. And anyways, I would get the draft prepared, I'd send them out to Bob, and he would send them back with edits everywhere. And sometimes I wondered, geez, did I sleep through some of these meetings? The man had an absolutely fantastic memory for detail. Now, I don't know, maybe this Beyster book, maybe when he looked in, and he saw something cryptic written there, somehow that gave him total recall. The Beyster book never worked for me, but he sure liked it. Over the years, we probably made as many as 100 visits. I would say each was very unique, each enjoyable and rewarding both for Bob and the DNA folks. Through many of these visits, DNA saw Bob as more than the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. He was someone who spoke their technology-laced language and was a friend of the agency. He believed DNA's work was vitally important to the nation and was certainly not bashful about promoting it to the senior management in the Pentagon. He was also viewed as a man of integrity. If the government had enough faith in us to select us to work their programs, then we certainly had an obligation not to disappoint. In February of '97, DNA demonstrated their appreciation through presentation of their Lifetime Achievement Award. The award was given to only a few non-government scientists who made significant contributions over the years to the agency programs. Looking back, I suspect Bill Scott may have been right, that Bob did have a soft spot in his heart for DNA. However, I think in addition to that, I think Bob saw the SAI work in support of DNA as an extension and a broadening of the nuclear weapons issues he addressed in that first contract. Over the years, the problem focus and technology changes, of course, or challenges changed, but the intellectual horsepower and the commitment required to achieve or solve the tough physics problems remained unchanged. Hence, I think there was an element of personal enjoyment and satisfaction he derived from SAI's support to DNA. Now, whether you accept my reflection or you have a theory of your own, we all must be in awe of the time and the energy he gave to a business segment that was less than 1% of company revenue. Must be that a nuclear physicist-trained CEO understands that 1% matters, and that in Bob's case, every 1% mattered. Maybe it's a quantum management thing. In ending, I'd like to share with you a couple of thoughts George Ulrich provided. George was a very good friend of Bob's and a former deputy director of the Defense Nuclear Agency. George said that there's no question that through SAIC and his abiding personal commitment, Bob contributed more to the DoD nuclear enterprise than anyone else on the industry side of the equation. And George went on to say he wishes he could dial back the clock and recapture that sense of purpose and dedication that personified Bob and permeated the nuclear community. Thank you.
Nice job, Gil. Thank you, Gil. Could you leave that Beyster book up here with me? Okay. Hadi Bozorgmanesh. Did I get that right? The MC always loves one name. This is it. Hadi Bozorgmanesh worked with Dr. B in San Diego and then moved to France in the 1980s to lead European business development for SAIC. Hadi and his wife Cheryl traveled from Connecticut this weekend, and I'm told that Bob and Betty had many European travel adventures after meeting with Hadi overseas. And he's going to share some of those special moments with us today. Please welcome Hadi to the stage.
Nice job. Ben can still surprise you by doing something right, but that's great. It's really an honor to be part of the celebration of Bob's life, but more importantly, I am absolutely overjoyed by reflecting all the great memories of working for Bob for 30 years in the company and having the pleasure of socializing with Bob and Betty and Beyster family in many occasions. Bob had many tricks for building SAIC. One of them was finding and hiring what he called triple threats. The triple threats was, in his definition, the people who were deep technologically, had great innovative way of managing, and were entrepreneurial with strong market instinct. And Bob really reflected those the best. I feel like that guy, the drunk guy, who can't say the words and he comes with an alternative. When Bob decided that European business was important for the company, it really changed our lives because we were exiled to Europe as the first persons to build the business there. And it was a tremendous pleasure because we got to know Bob better and Betty better. And they came for over 10 years each year to visit us. Bob will come in, obviously, and we will spend enormous amount of time in board meetings and visiting with the affiliate, and Bob would do his love of going to call on customers. And he had one particular customer that he absolutely had to see, and that was Lord Brown, who was the CEO and chairman of BP. They had a great deal in common. They were both physicists, and Bob was this great innovator who had created SAIC out of basically his first contract. And Lord Brown had built the BP from a small company, relatively small company, to the second largest energy company in the world. And every meeting was practically started the same way. Lord Brown will come in with the latest gadget, and Bob pull out his Beyster book. And it was a contest. Every year he would have a new electronic gadget, and Bob will have the same Beyster book and the blue pen, and there's no question who won. It was the Beyster book, but never out of fashion. And one day we were having salmon in Lord Brown's office. Out of nowhere, he looks at Bob and says, "Bob, you know, I've been thinking. Speaking is one of the worst ways to communicate. That involves many muscles. It involves a lot of neural nerves. You have a lot of smart scientists in your company. Why can't you come up with a way where we can transfer thoughts?" And you know, Bob being a very pragmatic person, he immediately switched to voice over IP, which was his passion. He said, "No, look, you know, I can't do thought transfer, but let me tell you the thing that's going to be a changer in your business," and went through the entire lecture about voice and content over IP, and that was 15 years ago. Today, we recognize that his pioneering thought about voice over IP and the content over IP is what is changing many of our lives. After doing a lot of work, every year we took a vacation, and it was always started the same way. Betty and my wife Cheryl would dutifully sit in the back seat of the car. Bob would sit on the passenger seat with a stack of map, and I would sit on the driver's seat, but I wasn't really in control. Bob would focus on the map the same way he would focus on a spreadsheet or on income statement or on time sold charts, or, he would come up with a really innovative and creative path to go from point A to point B and tell me which way to go and which way not to go. And it was always the same. He would look down. Every 10 minutes, he'd look around, and he had this great statement: I know exactly where we are. And then this would repeat itself 10 minutes later. Except every once in a while, we knew exactly we were lost. And we were in the middle of nowhere. And those rare occasions, Bob was convinced that the maps were wrong. And we learned very quickly Bob loved World War history. And so we adjusted our trips. He wanted to walk on the same beaches as Omaha Beach Landing. He wanted to see the marginal lines, which were incredible architecture of Fiat, and he would know all the reasons why the French lost and the Germans got around them. And we would go see war memorial cemeteries and museums, and he was absolutely lover of the World War history. Second thing Bob loved was soups. And every place where we went, we had to look for restaurants that opened early and had soup. And Betty and Cheryl, my wife, would spend a lot of time coming up with restaurants with a 2-star Michelin, and had this great menu and great wine selection, and would talk to Bob about it. Bob would say, "But do they have soups?" And if you could entice Bob to any restaurant by saying they have a good menu, but they also have soup, he would go along. So we took a lot of adventurous trips, and I'm going to go through a few of those. I had a bunch of them in here, but our friend Marianne censored most of them, and that's the first time somebody has cut me off. But anyhow, so one of the first trips we took, we went to Catalonia. As you may know, Catalonia is part of Spain, and we took the car and went over the mountainous region of Catalonia, not knowing that the separatists had just blown up a post office, and we had left our passports with the hotel people, and all of a sudden there was a roadblock with the soldiers came over and had the gun inside of our window asking for our passports. And obviously we didn't have passport. We had our driver's license, 4 California driver's license, and the soldiers did not speak English, but thank God for Betty's partial knowledge of Spanish. And Betty took over, and we could hear the conversation between the soldiers and the headquarters for California, da-da-da-da-da. And finally, Betty convinced them to let us go, and they did. All the way back to the hotel, Bob goes, Betty had saved us. And Betty was the hero in that trip. And another time, we decided to rent a barge and take the 8 or 10-day trip through Canal de Midi. And not knowing the train, we hired a captain who was supposed to cook for us, and we would be the guide and pilot the barge. We soon found out that the captain or the guide really didn't like to cook, but he loved our wine selection. And he was at it all the time. And so after the second day, we parked the barge, and he told us, as a tourist guide, to climb this hill, and there was going to be a great museum on top of the hill. So 4 of us struggled. We got on top of the hill just in time for the museum to be closed. And then he had told us he was going to take the barge on the other side of the hill and then come down on the other side of the hill. He would be waiting for us in a little village. Never told us there was no path to go on the other side of the hill. So the only way to get on the other side is to go through somebody's olive grove, an olive field. And we had to go over walls. All of a sudden, there was gunfires. It was the hunting season for the wild boar. So as we are rushing down the hill, pretending that this is funny, we were really scared. And we were smiling and laughing, going over the hill and going over the small stone walls. We finally get to the bottom of the hill. And Bob pondered our situation and talked us into doing a mutiny. And we throw basically our captain and our pilot overboard, and Bob took over as the captain and the pilot. And I was in charge of opening the locks, and Betty took control of the kitchen, and Cheryl goofed off as usual. And what was amazing, Bob was on his happiest, being in charge of the barge and controlling the canals, and for 7 days that we traveled through that canal. What was more interesting is that Bob had us believe that we were behind the mutiny, whereas in reality, you know who was behind the mutiny. So another occasion that we had tremendous fun was going through the, can I tell that story? Is it too long? We had just visited the tomb of Machiavellian, and we were looking for a restaurant which had soup, and we had found one. And we were tired and we were hungry. So we sat there, and just before we ordered, the young man, 20-year-old waiter came in and said, "Are you American?" And we said, "Yes." He sat next to Betty and started pouring his heart out that he's met this young girl who is American and a student here for a year, and he wants to marry her, and her parents would not allow it. So he was asking Betty, and Betty is the kindest person I've ever met, and she is pouring all she could do to condole this young man. He's asking Betty if she would go to Oklahoma and convince her her parents to allow this marriage to take place. Thank God that this guy's father, who was the chef, came out and ordered him to go back to work. One of the things that Bob was really proud was he sponsored the Global Challenge in UK. This is a race that goes around the world. None of the crew are professional. They are coming from different walk of life. The only experienced person is the captain. And the meeting we had with the crew and the captain was extraordinary in a sense that these people had mortgaged their house or have left their job in order to take this trip around the world. And they were so grateful to Bob. And you could see Bob in his basic element of real sailor and proud to be, and he followed the race, and he, when they were ahead, he was proud. When they weren't ahead, behind the scene, he would encourage them. They're gonna make it back there, or they're gonna catch up over there. And he was really proud of that. And finally, we would wake up every morning and go jogging no matter where we were. And in England, they have this public footpath, which is grandfather. You could run through people's farms or through the people's properties. And one day we were jogging, there was this barn that was falling apart. Inside of that barn, there was a car that neither of us could recognize what it was. And we were curious. We weren't around this car. We couldn't figure out what it was, rusty old car. And all of a sudden, Bob had this pensive look in his face. And he said, you know, this is what I worry about SAIC. I don't want to see in 20 years people look at SAIC and say, I wonder what this was all about. He always had the company in his mind, and he loved the company and he loved the people. And he molded thousands of us to be triple threat. And for that, we are always grateful to him. And because of that, the company prospered, and many of us prospered. And I am so honored and blessed to have been friend with Bob and worked for him, and friend to Betty and friend to Beyster's family. We miss Bob tremendously. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Howard.
And so wonderful to see you all.
Thanks, buddy. Thank you, Hadi. No speaker wanted to follow Hadi, so we thought we would change it up a little bit. We have a very special video tribute to Dr. Beyster for you now. Please turn your attention to the screens.
I founded SAIC because I really wanted a good place to work. I really wasn't interested in making money, but I was interested somehow in doing entrepreneurial things. And I didn't read it from anybody. I did it that way because I thought it was right. The country was shocked in 1983 when we lost the America's Cup to the Australians. Our people who were naval architects, many of them in Washington, decided to take a look at it with the encouragement of the Navy. She was very pretty. I mean, she laughed a lot and did not seem to get upset by small things. I wrote this book because it's a story that needed to be told about the motivating power of employee ownership and the culture that ensues in a company owned by the employees.
Wasn't that fantastic? The folks at Leidos and SAIC, the Beyster family, and three very talented folks I used to work with at SAIC, David Tilson, Bonnie Nichols, and Brad Hensley. Let's give them a round of applause for putting that together. Okay, back to the speakers. In keeping with our East Coast speaker invasion, our next one comes to us from New Jersey, where he is the J. Robert Beyster Distinguished Professor at Rutgers University's School of Management and Labor Relations. He's also the director of the Beyster Fellowship Program, where outstanding scholars are selected to research the role of broad-based employee ownership, innovation, and entrepreneurship. There are more than 25 Beyster Fellows from leading research institutes across the country. To share his thoughts on Bob's impact on the practice and educational field of employee ownership, please welcome Professor Joseph Blasi.
I want to thank every member of the Beyster family. Very honored for this opportunity to convey Bob's thoughts, not my thoughts, on employee ownership. I did a long interview with him several years ago, and that interview inspires much of what I'm going to talk about today. Dr. J. Robert Beyster, inventor, scientist, entrepreneur, scholar of, you imagine me to say physics, I'm going to say employee ownership. Let me tell the story of this wonderful man and these interesting ideas. Caring, what does it mean? It means thinking about, paying attention to, nourishing, checking up on. Dr. Beyster cared very deeply about people. He cared somewhat about organizations. For him, organizations were malleable. He could put them together and take them apart like building blocks. But people were the most important building blocks. He cared most in an ethical, in a philosophical, in a social, in a political way about an idea centered around people, and that idea was employee ownership. Many of us would even say he was religious about the idea. When I sat down for a long interview with him about his life and thoughts, he carefully entwined the idea of employee ownership in his entire life story. He actually explicitly told me where the idea came from. He said it came from the fundamental idea of fairness, that the people who created wealth should share that wealth. He tied this specific idea to Christian social values emphasized when he was very young. There are always discoveries in such interviews. The single one person he credited with inspiring him about this idea day to day, especially regarding how he built the company and stayed with the idea decade after decade, was his wife, Betty. And here's what he told me. He told me that he always had her total ideological support to make employee ownership as an expression of fairness the central tenet of his business approach. He told me she always had his back on this idea. He was very clear about this in my interview with him. He believed that people who were owners would build a different kind of organization and that this would guide their actions in their work, and that ownership would impact how they treated their customers and each other, which he believed would be completely different. He also believed that widely held ownership of business was necessary for a free society and for democracy to exist. We shall see in a moment what he did with this idea, because as you know, Dr. B always did things with ideas. He was a scientist after all, so he took ideas, carried them into the laboratory, set them loose in the world, measured, poked, and invented things out of them, and delivered them to the world, and kept going back to check up how they were doing. So all of us who talked with and interacted with and worked with and argued with Dr. Beyster knew when he cared about an idea, it had real consequences. It had results. It made a difference. He would always do things with ideas. Dr. Beyster was deeply ideological about employee ownership in a way, we must be honest, that sometimes put off other people or led to disagreements. One can only really understand his stubbornness and relentlessness because it was not for him a mere business practice or a tool or a policy. It was mainly, as he told me, an ethical, a philosophical, and social fundamental connected, as he believed, to a basic human right. Regarding persons, because he believed that ownership was a natural right, he held that those who produced the wealth should share in the wealth that they produced. He believed and acted as if persons were motivated by ownership in a very fundamental way. We hear so much of him as an entrepreneur. For him, entrepreneurship was not mainly a me sort of thing, about imagining and building and having something as big and influential as it could be. Entrepreneurship was about taking on important problems, being competitive, participating in a meritocracy, and making a difference. It was about social entrepreneurship, namely bringing the entire team along in the process of team ownership, employee ownership over that something, and watch them build a better organization that made a difference in the process. I'm sure many of you will be sympathetic with this next story. Even with professors, he could be demanding about the idea. Once, a year after he praised one of my books, that felt very good, he had me back to La Jolla the next year and asked, "Well, how are you? How is the family? And then, what have you done lately that's new on employee ownership?" I mentioned what I was working on over the last year, and he looked at me intently and he said, "You know, Joseph, that's not new or interesting. You should make a new contribution and do something really important." He was a taskmaster, even with the J. Robert Beyster professor. Employee ownership had consequences for the way he built organizations. When he spoke about the early days of building SAIC, he recounts how the story of scientists working together unfettered by the weight of hierarchical bureaucracy on big idea projects also meant figuring how to design profit sharing and equity shares from the very first days. For him, employee ownership was part of the very DNA, another DNA, of SAIC. It was the energy source of the organization. It was a critical way the organization contributed to society. It was also his personal science project in the realm of organizational behavior. If one looks into his archives, one sees that he spent a lot of time figuring out how to share profits and equity with coworkers based on their performance. He spent a lot of time figuring out how to structure employee ownership as the glue of SAIC. It was not simply a way of cashing an equity check for him. It was fundamental. It was DNA. It was the way he believed society should look. It was deep, and one could not dig it out of him with a bunch of lawyers and accountants and investment bankers. He told me that he threw many investment banker and lawyer and accountant out of his office to go back and just figure out how to make employee ownership work. And they did, year after year, for more than 35 years, right up to being in the middle of the Fortune 500 business listing. How much of a pioneer was Bob Beyster on employee ownership? The current leaders of Silicon Valley who do employee ownership were in kindergarten when he initiated the idea into a science-based company. He was only 40 years ahead of his time. Finally, employee ownership had consequences for his legacy. And like everything else he did, he was thorough and scientific about it. Inside SAIC, he ran a kind of ongoing social science seminar on making employee ownership work and studying it. I was repeatedly surprised that as he aged, he always talked like one of my young, enthusiastic undergraduates when employee ownership came up. Early on, he spent some of his time and liked it when his coworkers spent their time describing company employee ownership experiences to other entrepreneurs and business leaders. As you know, countless CEOs, founders, and SAIC spin-off organizations took this business approach from his inspiration. As evidence, I present a touching example of his simple sincerity on this issue when I met him almost 3 decades ago. We were at a conference. After I presented a paper on employee ownership, he came up to me at the conference on the subject and introduced himself. It was a 2-minute conversation, and I frankly had absolutely no idea who he was or what SAIC was, but I was too embarrassed to ask. Like any young business professor encountering a CEO, I would always ask, "Would you talk to my class?" He said yes, and I ran off to my next session. A few weeks later, his chief of staff of this very busy man calls me up and says, "Where and when do you want him? What airport does he land at? And he's giving you his entire day." How generous. By now, we all know who he was. We all knew who he was. And Dr. B came to my business class and spoke about the idea as a scientist and as a human being. He sent some of the smart students to La Jolla to interview for jobs with SAIC. He came to the pasta dinner at my house after the class and spoke to every young undergraduate as if they were the only person in the room, and I know all of us know that. He sat there until midnight talking. This was Dr. B. He set up the Foundation for Enterprise Development, now headed by his daughter Marianne, here in La Jolla, to study and educate others about employee ownership. He wanted to see evidence scientifically collected and then applied in the real world on employee ownership. He supported the Beyster Institute at UCSD to develop serious employee ownership programs in an entrepreneurial business school. He endowed the first chair, the J. Robert Beyster Distinguished Professorship on Employee Ownership at Rutgers University, that I hold now, to serve as an East Coast nodal point. As many of us saw in his career, he respected the energy of the young scientist and the young inventor. He founded the Beyster Fellowship Program, managed by Rutgers University's School of Management and Labor Relations on behalf of the nation, in order to spread the serious research of employee ownership throughout academia, with a special focus on young scholars. Today, there are over 120 scholars and professors in more than 30 states at 40 universities doing serious research on the subject. And they meet in the Beyster Symposium here in La Jolla, a few miles from his and Betty's home, every June. It is not conventional. The idea certainly is not conventional. And advocates are needed to remind politicians and business leaders of how it relates to fundamental human rights. I will end with this. Dr. Beyster influenced many people. He built lots of things. He did lots of projects. He knew that one idea would be enduring and eternal. He knew it would outlast particular organizations and particular attempts, and he did so much to make sure that it would go on and on and on with his support into the future. And that idea was employee ownership. It is not just his memory. He literally, with all these organizations and programs and fellowships he created, he literally intentionally set the table so that many organizations and people, young people, would carry the academic study and the practical application of this idea he cared about so deeply forward into the world. Thank you, Dr. Beyster.
Thank you, Professor Blasey, for sharing your thoughts on the true secret sauce that made SAIC so unique in corporate America. Finally, not finally, final speaker, but finally a speaker who's not from the East. This guy is one of the first people from SAIC that I met back in the 1980s when one of his many hats for the company was interacting with Capitol Hill offices. Chuck Nichols joined the early SAI and was the company's first general counsel. An avid sailor, active community leader, and former Commodore of the San Diego Yacht Club, Chuck was also instrumental in directing San Diego's efforts to host both the America's Cup races and the Super Bowl. As a good friend of Bob's, Chuck is going to remind us of some of Bob's more charming habits, the backstory on the company's involvement with the America's Cup races, and the significant impact Bob and Betty have had and continue to have in San Diego. Welcome, Chuck Nichols.
Good afternoon. Jim Russell, you can stand in the back if you can sleep. I want to make sure you're at least standing when I... Betty and family, I am honored to be able to speak to this group today. It's a very special occasion. I think, as most of you would gather by now, that Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer, as he recruited his friends to paint his fence and had them enjoying doing it, had nothing on Bob Beyster. Bob was an absolute class by himself when it came to one-on-one recruiting, and I think you hear that in each of the speakers. Case in point, in the spring of 1970, I was a young Air Force officer at Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino, California, and I was going to get out of the service in a few months. And I was describing at a party one night at the officers' club what I was looking for. And I really wanted to I didn't think I wanted to go to a law firm. I was in the JAG Corps there at the Air Force. I didn't want to go to a law firm. I really wanted to get in with a young entrepreneurial company that had just been a startup, where you could get stock, get equity in the company, and grow with the company. Well, there was a young fellow listening to me, a fellow officer, and he said, I know a company exactly like that. The next day, he brought down to my office some information on SAI. And that information was a little Xeroxed 20-page brochure with a little comb. You know, it had a little covers on it. It had that little comb in the back of it. That's what the company's brochure was. And it was 20 pages long. One page described what the company's capabilities were. The other 19 pages were the resumes of the employees in the company, 14 of whom were PhDs, and the others largely master's degrees, and people with incredible credentials. 20 people in this little company. I was fascinated. And along with that came several months, because that's all the company was months old, several months of financials. And now, young company, startup company, on every single one of those months, as I read through the financials, the company was profitable from the very beginning. From the first month, it had never not turned a profit. I thought, this is unbelievable. Immediately, I looked at the phone number, I called up the company and asked to talk to Bob Beyster right on the spot. Incredibly, he got on the phone. And I immediately blurted out everything I'd ever done without taking a breath, because I thought I had only one shot. And Bob got to the end, I got to the end of that, and I took a breath, and Bob said, well, how old are you? I just told him that I was briefing these generals in Washington on these major Air Force disputes, and I was doing negotiations with the contractors, that big multi-million-dollar things, and I was the JAG officer, and I'd gone to the University of Texas Law School. And he said, how old are you? I said, 28, but I'm almost 29. Literally. And Bob said, well, he said, good. He said, we don't really want too many old people around here anyway. He giggled and said, I know I'm not supposed to say that. But he did. So he had me from that moment. And when they made an offer, I accepted it before they could revoke it. What I didn't know at the time was I wouldn't get an office because Bob, it was a tough fiscal year. Every year was tough to Bob. It was always tough. Things were hard. And he said, we don't want to overrun our overhead accounts, so we don't have enough, we're growing and we don't have enough offices. So we don't have enough offices. So what am I going to do? Well, there's always somebody on travel. So you just take your box of goodies and you go around the company and you find who's ever going to be gone, and that's your office. I did that until February of the following year. That was the new fiscal year. We had hoped to do $1 million worth of business that year. 19 saying we hoped to do $1 million worth of business. We did 1.18 million, and I got an office. It was a wonderful time. Over the years, I saw Bob completely captivate any number of prospective employees and customers with that one-on-one capability. And they immediately were his best friend when they walked out of the office, and they had an immediate connection. It was an unbelievable thing. He had another disarming tactic, of course, too, and it was Bob's personal dress code. You've heard a little bit about it today already. Bob would be off to Washington in his white socks and his threadbare blue blazer to go see the customers. And you know, when those customers sat across from Bob looking like that, they knew he wasn't going to waste their money. Pete Jackson, who was the business manager, I don't know if Pete's here today, he was the business manager at the time. Pete and I would say to Bob, Bob, you're representing the company. We're getting to be somebody. Would you just get a new sport jacket, for gosh sakes? And so Bob, ultimately he did. He bought a new sport jacket. I think he gave that old one to Matt Briner. I think Matt still wears that jacket today. As you've heard, Bob was a true American patriot. Many ways. One of the indications of Bob's patriotism was he only bought American cars. He did not buy foreign cars. And he didn't like it. And I'm telling you, in those days, American cars weren't much. If you remember the 70s, I mean, Toyotas were outselling everything, and you know. But if we bought a BMW or a Toyota or something like that, Bob was not happy, and he would let you know. He did not think you should be buying those cars. He thought you should be buying American. In fact, I remember going to a meeting with Bob. We were off to a meeting somewhere in town. We went down to get in Bob's car. He had an old Chevrolet at that time. And I went in to get in my side of the car on the passenger side. I opened the door, and there is a fully complete toilet seat assembly sitting in the passenger seat. Bob reached over, he gets a little bit embarrassed, he puts it in the back. He said, Betty sent that along so I'd know what to pick up at the hardware store. Bob liked solving complicated problems. He was an experimental physicist, as you know, and he really enjoyed experimenting. And he did a lot of that with sailboats, because sailboats are a complicated piece of machinery. To do a sailboat, just to drive a sailboat recreationally takes an understanding of the water, the wind, the waves, the sails, the hull, and get it going in some proper direction is no small task. But to get the last ounce of energy and performance out of a race boat is a very difficult thing to do. And I think Bob just loved the technical challenge and the mental challenge of sailing while having the serenity of being out there in the environment in the water. It was a wonderful thing to watch him on the water. In the early years, we all worked night and day, and there really wasn't much time to do anything else. But Bob found time occasionally. He would partner with one of the employees who wanted to get a sailboat and needed some help. Bob would partner with him and get the sailboat. And I got the benefit of riding in some of those sailboats with some of the people who are in this room that were partners of Bob's. He didn't get to play boats much in those days because he was too busy. But when he did, he really dug it. You could tell that it was something that was in his blood. In 1983, of course, the New York Yacht Club was defending the America's Cup in Newport, Rhode Island. Well, Bob got the idea. We're going to do a management council. We had those quarterly management meetings that everybody would shake their head up and down. Yes, yes, we had these management meetings. And he decided, why couldn't we go and get a cruise ship? He talked with Rob Morton. Rob Morton got us set up on a small cruise ship where we could stay in that cruise ship and do our meetings on the cruise ship out on the America's Cup course instead of doing it at a hotel in Newport at essentially the same price. So it was a win-win. So there we are out there on the race course. Between meetings, we were watching Dennis Conner get beat by John Bertrand's Australia with his winged keel. It was a devastating loss for the United States. Here was a little country not known for its technology, Australia, beating this technological giant, the U.S., with technology. And in a way, it was bothered Bob. And so when we got home, Bob asked Barry Shillito, who was on our board at the time and for many years, to talk to Dennis Conner's mentor, who is the sailing guru and real estate baron here in San Diego, Malin Burnham. I don't know if Malin Burnham is here this afternoon, but he might be. And he said, Malin, why don't you come and talk to SAIC about the reasons the Australians won? And maybe Dennis can learn something from it, and maybe we'll do something with you. So Malin talked with Dennis and got Dennis to agree to come to a meeting at the company. So as they drove out, Malin likes to tell the story, as they drove to La Jolla to see the company, Dennis said, I only want to spend 30 minutes with these people. We're going to leave. So they went into the meetings. Our naval architects and engineers described to Dennis, using techniques they had learned in Navy contracts, why the wing keel was better and had better lift and less drag than what Dennis's conventional keel was, and he was doomed from the start. 2.5 hours later, Dennis left with a handshake deal that SAIC was going to be his design coordinator for his next racing boat when he went down to try to take it back from Australia. In 1987, Dennis got off the airplane in San Diego, proudly holding aloft the America's Cup. It was quite a time. Interestingly enough, and Bob knew this, people were very interested in what the company had done that caused that transformation. So lots of customers, we instantly became better known nationally and internationally for our capabilities. People were interested in talking to us about what we did for the America's Cup, and then they'd talk to us about what their needs were. So it turned out to be a remarkably good thing for SAIC in looking at its future business. Now, after '87, when Dennis won, there were several teams vying then for the U.S. to become the next defender of the Cup. Bob got the idea that let's create something which was called the Partnership for America's Cup Technology, or PACT. And that PACT's job was to provide software tools to all of the defending potential U.S. teams who are vying to become the defender for the America's Cup against the next challengers. Turns out that Bill Koch's team, the America Cube team, actually won that and defended the Cup, and they were one of the beneficiaries of PACT's technology. It was a very interesting time. And Bob continued on with the America's Cup. He understood that these projects were fun and exciting for the people who worked on them, and they were a source of pride to other employees who didn't work on them. And there were a lot of people in the company who volunteered for the America's Cup, took great pride, and across groups, they talked about their America's Cup experiences and developed relationships inside the company, and sometimes that was as important as developing relationships outside the company, as many of you will know. And it became a glue, in a way, like the stock was, for a lot of people in the company who wanted to do something exciting and important and that people could recognize outside the company. Bob's affection for his boats continued through his final days. His weekly jaunts on his sailboat, the Blue Moon, which he had for many years, were some of his brighter, more fun times. And later on, his Hinckley, the Solutions, which is still at San Diego Yacht Club. It's a gorgeous yacht, and Bob loved to go out on it. Early on, Bob and his beloved Betty saw the need to give back to the community. Their charitable gifts to this community and outside around the country go back more than 4 decades. Of course, Bob founded the organizations that you've heard talked about today. But many years ago, he created the Beyster Family Foundation, and he made sure to include Jim and Mark and M.A. in the management of that organization so that they could get the understanding of the importance of philanthropy and investing to support it. The family has been active in more than 50 local organizations whose mission, in every sense, is to change lives. As you have seen, Bob and Betty had been longtime supporters at UCSD, and one of the few donors at UCSD who provide support across multiple schools. You've heard about the professorship, scholarships for the underserved, a leading-edge cardiovascular center, and a business school for entrepreneurs and innovators. All of those things at UCSD across many departments. And not unlike Bob's philosophy at SAIC, he liked also to support new fledgling startup charitable kinds of things like the Olivewood Learning Center and Garden in National City. Betty, I know, was very fond of the ARCS Foundation for young scholars, and it's something that she has had a wonderful relationship with for many years. I think it's a wonderful organization. So in addition to places like UCSD and USD and the University of Michigan, Bob had money for the little guys too. He enjoyed meeting with Father Joe Carroll and Father Joe's Village. I think Father Joe Carroll might be here today, Father Joe. But Bob liked talking with Father Joe about the entrepreneurial approaches for helping homeless people and families. And so they developed this relationship. To the observation of many people in this room, of course, Betty was the main force that kept Bob going. She supported his work totally. He was able to grow the company and traveled a lot, and Betty stayed there, never complaining. She was a gracious hostess on countless events and smiled and chatted with people who walked up with her, probably with more intent than just being friends. They were after something, maybe. Betty just smiled and stayed serene the entire time. Betty, without you, the SAIC that we knew wouldn't have happened. Thank you. And to so many of us here today, Bob and Betty were generous to a fault. The size of this turnout is testimony to our respect and appreciation. Rest in peace, Dr. B.
Thank you, Chuck. Those beautiful words. Representing her family, our final speaker this afternoon is Bob and Betty's daughter, Mary Ann, better known to all as M.A. She is an engineer. She's on her way up, too. I can see it. She's an engineer, manager, principal investigator, and now a filmmaker with an award-winning documentary on shared ownership and entrepreneurship. She's also put in a considerable amount of time and effort in organizing today's celebration for her father. M.A. is going to share a few memories about growing up in the Beyster family. Let's give her a very, very warm welcome. You're the best.
Well, thank you all for being here today. So I'll share a few stories from the family's perspective. So in the early 80s, our family used to take Sunday drives. And we would drive in my father's Chevy Malibu. And we'd go exploring. And we'd go exploring all around San Diego. And my brothers and I thought with no particular destination, but I think my dad had some things in mind. So we would go to Balboa Park, Julian, the Scripps Aquarium, Cabrillo, Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery. We'd drive even locally to La Jolla Cove, where we'd go snorkeling. And our dad was our first tour guide. He just knew all these facts, and he knew all these stories about every single place that we went to. He simply loved this community and wanted us to love it as much as he did. And he left his Beyster book at home. In the late 70s, our Sunday rituals changed from driving to sailing. Dad had purchased a 32-foot sloop called the Valiente, and she was an absolutely beautiful boat. And he signed us all up for sailing classes. My brothers, my mom, and me. And we dutifully took them. And we went to Mission Bay Aquatic Center, and we took our sailing classes. And it's one thing to learn how to sail on an 8-foot sabot in the calm of Mission Bay, which you can see how calm it is. And it was another to crew on the Valiente, sailing out of the San Diego Bay in the rough waters off of San Diego into the Pacific Ocean. And my mom and my oldest brother, Jim, they actually had sea legs. Thankfully, my other brother, Mark, and I had 2 saving graces. And that was one, Dad also liked to sail in the bay, which was calmer. And so we would sail back and forth underneath the Coronado Bridge. And the second was his real crew of the Valiente were his fellow SAICers, who seemed to be competent sailors, and who were also very, very compassionate to their younger crew, and who didn't quite have their sea legs. And they'd put us to work and somehow have us laughing throughout the whole time. And it was always a really good day out on the water. And then we'd enjoy the warmth of the Venetian restaurant in Point Loma for post-sailing pizza. When we were off to college in the 80s, the Sunday ritual changed to welcome sailing adventures on our returns home. And he had sold the Valiente, and he had purchased his dream boat, and that was the Blue Moon. My dad really liked being out on the water, and now when we came home, we can enjoy this with him as young adults during our fishing and scuba expeditions, which were off the boat. Beyond the sailing rituals, Dad had his holiday rituals as well, and he had them all worked out and orchestrated with my mom. For more than a decade, we'd celebrate New Year's Eve at Kona Kai Club. This is where he had the boat. Easter was brunch at Hotel del Coronado. Thanksgiving was at home. And Thanksgiving, we'd usually set the tables outside. And Mom would prepare an amazing 4-course dinner, from scratch, of course, for her family and for close friends. And when we were really young, my brothers and I also seemed to have an unplanned Thanksgiving ritual of our own, and that would be to dramatically spill milk across the entire table. And Dad's face would get so red, and it would kind of get bloated, and his neck would get kind of wide, and we'd just sit there in fear of what he was going to do for us, or to us. And everybody would just start laughing, break the ice, and Mom would be right behind us with the towels in hand for us to clean the table. So Thanksgiving evenings also usually ended with a movie. And Dad would, he'd pull out the Betamax, the VHS, the DVDs, or the Blu-ray of one of his favorite movies. And topping the list in the 70s were the Mel Brooks films. And so Dad would say, walk this way. You know where it's coming from. It's coming from Young Frankenstein. And we would just line up behind him and, of course, imitate any crazy walk that he would do. One of my mom's and my dad's another favorite of Mel Brooks is High Anxiety. And Nurse Diesel in the film would say, those of you who are tardy do not get fruit cup. So to this day, in our family, if you're going to be late or in some other way not meet family expectations, you're not to expect to get fruit cup. So of our favorite movies of the time, in that same time period, my father also really loved the Peter Sellers series in Pink Panthers. And one of my favorite films from my father was Dr. Strangelove. And this is a satire by Stanley Kubrick of the Cold War. It was totally silly and yet so incredibly serious, and Dad just knew it all too well. I'd have to say that Christmas rituals were my favorite. I was my father's Christmas elf. And so every Christmas Eve, we would meet for lunch, and I would bring my gift list, and he'd bring his. And over lunch, we would compare notes, and we'd come down with the short list of the shorter list and compressed list of gifts. And I would map out the most efficient way to get from one store to the other. And I have to say that there was never a year in over 30 years of doing this that we didn't go to his favorite store, and that was Radio Shack. And if we hadn't figured out a gadget for us to buy there for someone in the family, I would promise to buy him a gift. And I would wrap it, so it would be under the Christmas tree. And this would always get a little smirk from him in the morning and the day of unwrapping. Every year, we celebrated Christmas at my parents' house. And this is the same house they've been in since 1959. It's been a true pleasure. Dad had subtle but genuine acts of love, approval, and affection. He would congratulate us at our graduations, our promotions, our new positions, our other career achievements, our marriage, our children. He assumed being a tour guide to his grandson, Cody, as he visited museums in Washington, D.C. We'd celebrate life's moments, and then he'd encourage us to get back to work. He'd never settle. He was absolutely dedicated to my mother and to his family. And with my mother, he instilled deep values of compassion, hard work, fairness, humility, and community. We're all blessed to have more time with him after he retired from SEIC, and our family connections only got deeper and wider with him. You know, he lived a very grand life for 90 years, and he guided our family with grace and purpose. And to my dad, we'll meet again, as the saying goes of one of his favorite films. So thank you again for being here. And I want to welcome Gustavo back up to the piano to play a tribute piece that we felt was a composition that Gustavo has made, and it's very vibrant and has lots of spirit, and we thought you would very much enjoy it. So thank you.
Bravo, bravo, Gustavo. Excellent. Well, Chuck mentioned how much Bob and Betty do in our community for philanthropic causes. And Bob and Betty have been very good friends of the Salvation Army. So it's most fitting that we welcome Major Lee Lascano from the Salvation Army to offer a closing prayer. Major?
I invite you just to pause with me as we reflect. It's my privilege to pray a blessing upon the family and all that are gathered here. Most gracious and loving Heavenly Father, we thank you for the life of Dr. Bob Beyster, for the example that he set in integrity and in compassion, for the diligence and the hard work that helps so many people. So, Lord, we thank you. We thank you for his family, for his love for his family, for his care for them. Lord, we pray that you would help us to remember, just as we have heard today, that it is so important for each one of us to leave this world a better place. May we take his example to heart as we leave this place. And Lord, I pray for your blessing of comfort upon the family. Pray for Betty that you would surround her with your love, with your peace. For Marianne, for Jim, for Mark, for all the family, that right now they would sense just that peace that can come from you. And for everyone here, Lord, we pray that you would help us again just to think on these things and to be the people you would have us to be. May the Lord bless you and keep you now and forever. Amen.
Thank you, Major. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us in the celebration of this remarkable American patriot. Before you leave, though, let me make just a few announcements to help you enjoy the rest of your afternoon with us. First of all, you're invited to our reception at the South Poolside Terrace. There's going to be champagne flowing in celebration of Bob's life, but there's not going to be a formal toast, so please don't hold on to that glass too long. Second, one of Dr. B's favorite beverages was an Arnold Palmer, probably because there was never a non-alcoholic drink named after a sailor. But we are going to have Arnold Palmers there in addition to the champagne, so please enjoy those. Third, please don't forget to sign the guest books that are here. And finally, we welcome the posting of your experiences at today's celebration on Bob's blog, which is Beyster.com. Thank you again. The final Management Council is adjourned.